All right, so I'm going to be talking about the age of return migration. This is actually a play on a sociologist who wrote a book called The Age of Migration. And it was, the theme of that was just saying that we're moving into a period where migrations are defining the world. And I think that often gets misunderstood, is that this idea that that everyone's migrating and everyone's moving. And the fact of the matter is, very few people move, and particularly long distances. And as I like to remind most people, as a geographer, when I look at migrations, if someone moves, most likely they move very small distances. So I work on Rust Belt kinds of issues, whether they're rural communities or cities. And the idea is that everyone leaves the Rust Belt because it's a failed place, and they move to the Sun Belt. And the fact of the matter is, most people who, if they did leave their community, didn't go very far. They would leave Pittsburgh and move to Youngstown because Youngstown had manufacturing jobs available and Pittsburgh did not. But they stayed in the Rust Belt. Very few people left. And so when I'm talking about the age of return migration, I'm actually talking about something that's probably smaller than most people might think. But nonetheless, I would say it's a bigger phenomenon than most people realize, because you don't hear many people talking about return migration. Mostly you hear talk about people leaving. And so what this presentation is about is to reframe how we think about migration itself. Okay, so redefining migration, what do I mean by that? So typically we think someone leaves somewhere and moves to somewhere else. I like to think of migration from a people-centric perspective. People connect places. And this is very natural for geographers. Geographers really care about how different places are connected, how people perceive space. What does home mean? And home can be a lot more complicated than you think. Well, what we're looking at here is average annual net migration rates by age, 1980 to 2000. Now, I said I got rid of a lot of visuals. Well, this one I had to have in there. And it actually took a lot to get this in there. I won't go into those details. But what you're seeing is above the zero line here is a positive net migration. And the blue line, the lower line, is non-metro. And the upper line's kind of gold is metro. And so it's positive percentage, meaning the rate is more people moving in than moving out. And you'll notice that in non-metro, it's positive up until about 20 years of age. So you're getting young people moving into non-metro counties, okay? And the same is happening for metro. You notice that metro is positive throughout the entire life cycle. But you see where the metro peaks from about 20 to 30 years old, that's when non-metro becomes negative. So you can see that's where the exchange is going. And then as we get to about 30, it becomes positive in non-metro areas, and then the non-metro exceeds metro areas. Now, you can look at this and say, zero sum, people leave, and they go to the city. But that's not what really that graph says. If you look at the relationship between non-metro and metro, these migrations are connected. That people are clearly going from non-metro to metro and then coming back. It's return migration. This is the dominant pattern of this era of 1980 to 2000. It's not rural out-migration, it's return migration. This is the migration pattern that defines our lives today. All right, here's the big deluge of words, but I'll walk you through it. So demographic trends, global versus local, what does that mean? Well, most people frame demographic trends as local or regional, meaning whatever happens locally or regionally is what impacts the migration. So you do something, it makes people leave, or you do something in the region or in the town that makes people come there. But migration is global. Global forces shape migration. So that return migration trend you see is a result of global economic shifts, not regional shifts, not local shifts. So a lot of what's impacting the migration pattern is really beyond the control of a town or a region. whether it's a successful city or a successful town, successful region, a successful state, a successful nation state. No policies are really affecting those migration trends. They're above and beyond that. And so I think it's a little bit of hubris to think you're going to make major changes to migration trends when really these global forces are the ones that's shaping it. And if you're worried about outmigration, it's really not your town's fault. It's just that there are bigger things happening that are causing people to reconsider where they live. All right, so we have 3 economic eras over the last century. So it starts with manufacturing. I think manufacturing is often misunderstood. The peak of the manufacturing era was 1910, all right? Long time ago, over 100 years ago. And ever since 1910, manufacturing has been in decline, right? And a place such as Pittsburgh was at the top of the manufacturing world in 1910. It began really steady depopulation in 1910, not 1950, not 1970, not 1980, not 2000, 1910. 100-year trend of population decline for the city. And it really wasn't the city's fault. It was just that manufacturing was beginning to recede in terms of its global dominance. And then the next after that came the innovation era. Some people call it the knowledge economy. This is the rise of white-collar work or highly skilled work. And this begins to drive a different kind of migration. I'll get into that in a second. And then lastly is a term I invented. I call it the legacy economy. And really what the legacy economy is the impact of economic activities in cities that used to be manufacturing powerhouses, that they're having major impacts on the way the global economy works. And it's usually in eds and meds, higher education and healthcare. But I'm not talking about any higher education or any healthcare. I'm talking about exportable, tradable. So meaning if you're attracting students from other countries, you're exporting higher education. So cities such as Pittsburgh and Boston are excellent at this. Rochester, Minnesota exports healthcare. The entire economy of Rochester is really around the export of healthcare, where if you have a regional healthcare, you're cutting costs. You're being squeezed. You're like manufacturing in decline. The associated migration patterns for manufacturing, it's rural to urban. So we're talking about, remember, 1910 is when this really gets started. Then urban to suburban is with the innovation economy. And then return migration is associated with what you saw from 1980 to 2000. That's the rise of the legacy economy. This is the global economic trend driving that migration pattern. All right, global economy and iconic migrations, just to summarize. So you got one neat chart, not so many words. Manufacturing, the exemplar metro is Detroit. Great migration. So this is a US pattern. So that typically we think of the Great Migration as moving from the rural south to the urban north. And so, and it's really about declining wages in agriculture and rising wages in manufacturing. As manufacturing came up to global dominance, that's where the money was to be made. So you needed to move from a rural area centered around agriculture to an area, whether city or otherwise. You can have manufacturing plants in small towns. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Meaning that people would leave the farms and go to those places because they had manufacturing jobs. So it's the jobs, it's not the city. Then you have innovation, Bay Area. The dominant pattern is sprawl. So as you see sprawl explode, that's connected to the rise of the innovation economy. And lastly, legacy, as I said, of manufacturing. Pittsburgh's the exemplar. And the major iconic migration is urban millennials, the move back to the city. So the city during the innovation economy was profane. You needed to leave, sprawl. And now we're in the era of return migration. People are moving back to the cities. And that's what we're seeing. All right, so ZeroSum Model, place-centric. So UK inventing the brain drain. So with the rise of the innovation economy, white-collar workers, highly skilled people are suddenly extremely valuable. So we start paying attention to them. We start measuring what's happening with people who have college degrees. we start caring about the migration of scientists. And the United Kingdom, Britain, was obsessed with this. There was a national crisis during the 1960s of brain drain. And in 1969, there was a policy analysis done by the government that looked at all these reports and things about the purported brain drain. The results were a bunch of methodological criticisms of the brain drain studies. They were only using American immigration data. Why? Because that was the only data they had to use to look at this. It's not very good data to use to look at UK brain drain, but that was all they had, and so that was what was used to do this. Not distinguishing between permanent and temporary employment abroad. Just because somebody immigrated, so you have this immigration statistic, scientist shows up, doesn't mean they stayed there. Maybe they were there for a year. They were a visiting scholar at MIT, and then they went back to England. There was no way to track that. So that was part of the brain drain. And lastly, neglecting inflows. Ben Winchester just talked a lot about this. This is a big problem in what I would call popular demographic analysis. Neglecting inflows. It's all about who leaves, right? So this is this negative view of migration. This is this place-centric view because you can keep track of people who leave. They're not here anymore. You don't think about who's coming in. And so the entire brain drain hysteria that gripped the British Parliament, that informed all this policy, didn't even look at who was coming to the country, the scientists and the engineers. And yet, it was the dominant narrative of the time. So another way of looking at zero-sum modeling is place failure. Your place did something wrong, so people left. Again, these are global trends. There's nothing the place did wrong. You're just affected or impacted negatively by a global trend. But to think of it this way, you have the Great Migration. So African Americans left the oppressive South. And so they were fleeing something and just happened to end up in Chicago or Pittsburgh or New York. Just happened to end up there. And what that overlooks is that there was a lot of rural to urban migration of African Americans within the South. Moving from rural Mississippi to Atlanta, huge migration. Huge educated African American migration in the rural South. So the narrative of fleeing the oppression doesn't really quite hold up. But if you look at it as a global trend, a global impacts, you see rural to urban migration within the South. It's not all about leaving the South and going to Chicago. In fact, Chicago manufacturing firms aggressively recruited in the rural South. They used newspapers to get the word out. They would travel down by train and literally grab people and tell them what great opportunity awaited them. It wasn't just that people were waiting to flee, they had to be sold. They had to be told that there was something to move to. Okies fleeing, the Dust Bowl, the collapse of the agrarian economy in Oklahoma and the Great Plains. White flight, fleeing the cities because of violence, and poverty and those kinds of issues. That whites were leaving something behind, something that was awful. Leaving the industrial city, leaving the smokiness, the dirt. Rust Belt, economic collapse, calamity, everyone gets out of Dodge, moves to the glorious Sun Belt where jobs are aplenty. There we go. Now to think of this from a place-centric perspective, migration is aspirational, not I'm leaving something. So the Great Migration, as I detailed, was a move to manufacturing jobs. Agriculture was paying less money, manufacturing was paying more. So for your labor, you could make more money in a manufacturing job. So it didn't matter where that manufacturing job was, it's just that it was a manufacturing job that paid more. So you're moving to those kinds of opportunities. Okies, California dreaming. There are famous songs about dreaming of the splendor of California and the bounty that awaited these Okies. This is in popular folklore, that they were moving to what they thought was great opportunity. And okay, yes, a little bit of a catalyst in the cataclysms of the Dust Bowl. But Okies moved before then and after that. It was because, and in fact, after that, after the Dust Bowl settled, more migration happened. Why? Because people who moved to California said, hey, you got to come here. So there's no longer that push factor, but people kept going. So it must be something else going on. White flight, well, suburban idle. I want my patch of green earth. I want the picket fences, the yard and the kid, and the kids playing, the good schools and things like that. They weren't fleeing the city so much as they were seeking a suburban utopia. It was the sign of success. You said, I had a house in the suburbs, it meant you made it. You were successful at your job. Rust Belt, white-collar opportunities. Blue-collar workers did not flee the Rust Belt. I know this because I've researched it. In fact, the people who tended to stay behind were the people who worked in the mills. So they stayed there, they were unemployed, they had no idea where to go. But cities such as Pittsburgh, they worked very hard since 1910 to educate the populace because they knew manufacturing was on decline. Well, when the mills all closed, that meant all the associated white-collar jobs collapsed. So there were the jobs waiting for them when they graduated from college that their parents and grandparents worked so hard to put them through, so they had to leave. And during the innovation economy era, it was the people with the most education that relocated, not the people with the least. This is very different from the Great Migration, when the opposite was true. It was the people with the least education who were most likely to migrate. And this is in reaction to these global economic forces. So people versus place frameworks. So I'm going to paraphrase Randy Cantrell a little bit. He talked about new economic development model is people-focused. I'm adding not place-focused. Okay, so this focus on what people are doing and how we economically develop people as opposed to a place that has a bunch of people and economically develop that. When we're economically developing a place, we're talking about the manufacturing era. These economic development approaches are great for 1910, really bad for 2010. We need to keep in mind what kind of economic forces are in play when we think about economic development and when we think about migration and how it interacts with economic development. Neighborhood poverty rates. This is one of my favorite examples of when you have two different kinds of ways, like if it's place-centric or people-centric. So I was at a Federal Reserve Bank conference in Baltimore, and they're talking about how they're measuring the health of their neighborhoods. So this relates to, you can take any kind of geography and say the health of the community. And the poverty rates were intergenerationally high, persistent poverty. And they're saying these are our worst neighborhoods. And I said, you can't be sure about that. In fact, many of them might be your best neighborhoods. But your problem is that you're place-focused. You're just looking at the poverty rate of that place. Well, the poverty rate of a place does not track what happens to people who leave, a la the UK brain drain hysteria. They have no idea what's happening to people who leave. So there are neighborhoods where no one leaves. Those are the poorest of the poor neighborhoods. Those are the most distressed communities that you can find. But there are many neighborhoods that have high poverty rates that never change, but you see new people in there all the time. And so someone's coming from El Salvador, a rural area, a rural to urban migration, comes to an urban neighborhood in Los Angeles, and they're poorer than any of the poor in the United States. And so their income drags things down, and the poverty rate stays high. But then, within 5 years, they're making more money than the people who were born there in that neighborhood, and they move to the suburbs. They take that salary with them. That salary, that data point, migrates to a successful neighborhood. And it's really the people coming from the so-called distressed neighborhood that are making that neighborhood successful. That neighborhood that is exporting this talent, this success, is the best neighborhood in the entire city. It's where people are upwardly mobile. It is the best community possible in the entire United States, given the global economic constraints. Average income. This is another story. If you're looking at place or people, that tells two very different stories. So you take someone from a small town who's the best of the best in the small town. They earn an average higher wage, okay, or a higher wage than average. When they leave, they take that wage with them. So the average wage goes down. Bad outcome for place. Well, they move to New York City, they're young, they're new, their wage is going to be lower than the average wage in New York City. New York City, as a place, its average wage goes down. So that migration is a negative economic outcome. Both places see their average income go down. Average income going down in a place is, I think, universally accepted as a bad metric, right? A negative outcome. From a people-centric view, the migrant who moves from the small town to New York City is making more money annually. That's economic development. That is a success story, regardless of what happens in the places. The dominant view we have today, the geography that we put on the table and we derive policy from, like in the brain drain case, is exactly that sort of thing, is we're seeing average incomes go down and we think we have to do something about it. Meanwhile, the migrant is having the best possible outcome. The life has changed dramatically, earning so much more, doing the same job, the same skills, and earning sometimes double, triple, quadruple. And that's supposedly bad. Demographic myths, the urban world. You probably have heard it. A famous stat would be like, the world is now 70% urban and is urbanizing more. Well, a scholar at the London School of Economics took a look at this in the context of Africa. The first pervasive misconception is that Africa is urbanizing exceptionally fast due to intensive rural to urban migration. This is simply not true. He goes on in the, I'll spare you the analysis, but goes on to look at it and says, oh, you know, the urbanization rate, the rural to urban movement is much less than that of East Asia. It is historically no different, in fact, somewhat lower than it used to be decades ago. Yet, 80% of African countries have policies in place to prevent rural to urban migration. Demographic analysis says this is not the problem. The policies attack it as if it were the problem. There's a huge disconnect there, and it's causing major issues in African cities. So I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek. If we had Ben Winchester and he was doing work in Africa, what he might say, it is important from a policy perspective to appreciate this distinction between rates of urbanization. So think about that the graph you showed about the percentage of people living in rural and urban, and then the absolute change in population. Between the rates of urbanization and rates of urban population growth, most policymakers don't. These are the people pulling the levers, making the big decisions, and they're not making the correct distinction demographically. They're looking at the problem, the issues, the wrong way. Talent producers and refineries. So this is a Stamen Maps. They did analysis of IRS data, and it was just for 1 year, and they were really struck that New York was the biggest loser. They're like, how could New York be the biggest loser? It's the most successful metro economy on the planet. Why is it such the loser? Why it is a brain drain basket case? And it says here, New York County lost $1.3 trillion and 15,000 people on net. So that's the people who left on net and the net, their average salary, who left and who came in, and the differential. So $1.3 trillion more moved out in salary than moved in, right? Catastrophe. Doom and gloom. Well, they changed that and they said, well, because they kept seeing all these cities that they thought were successful that were the biggest losers. And they said, well, you're not a loser if you're losing money. You're an exporter. What I would call a talent refinery. Somewhere where a migrant from down the urban hierarchy moves and gets a greater return on skills. And then when they get done, they become return migrants. And they earn much more for what they do. They have refined skills in these global cities or in these places that I would call talent refineries. Now, to kind of take that in a different direction, not all places that attract talent, college-educated people, the proxy, attract talent, do well with those populations. So here you have Pittsburgh and Asheville, both gained a little over 10% in college, bachelor's or more, right? And here you have relative per capita income change, relative labor force participation, relative unemployment, and relative poverty. Pittsburgh had positive outcomes in those 4 categories. Asheville, North Carolina, and for that matter, Portland, Oregon, had negative outcomes for all those 4 categories. Why? Because Asheville and Portland are just merely interested in attraction, but don't do anything with those college degrees when they get there. There's no kind of economic development that goes on for the migrants that come in with college degrees. Whereas Pittsburgh, that's its whole reason of being. It economically develops people. This is why it's an epicenter of the legacy economy, because it is an expert at economically developing people. It is a people-focused community. Asheville is an amenities-focused community. Portland, Oregon is an amenities-focused community. It just wants people to come. Well, you have to do more than just get them to come. You have to get them to do things. And we've talked a little bit about that. It's like, it's great that you're attracting people, but you want to get them integrated in the community, and you want them to become change agents, and you want them to be part of the success of your community. Pittsburgh is a good model for that. All right, so return migration and talent production. So what you're looking at here is 1955 to 1960, the migration to California. The other part of the story that we tend to miss is from 1995 to 2000, Californication, right? The great out-migration, the exodus from California. Now, no one noticed the exodus because of all the immigration. So population in California was still booming. But all the best educated people were leaving. I call them real estate refugees. I used to live in Colorado in a small agricultural city called Longmont. And to the north in Fort Collins, we're full of telecommuters to San Francisco, right? And they're living in these big houses in Fort Collins, and they're making San Francisco wages. This is about what's beginning to transform the economic geography of the United States. These wages that are being forced out by high cost of living are changing the communities down the urban hierarchy. This is a return migration. And so in Pittsburgh, fed a lot of people to Silicon Valley, in Los Angeles. And now those people are coming back and starting businesses. And they maintain those connections. So my favorite example is this guy who was raised in New Jersey, goes to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, does video game design, goes to Los Angeles to work for Disney, then decides to move back, not to New Jersey, but to the place where the talent production and talent refinery goes on. Moved back to Pittsburgh and started his own business. What did he do? He primarily, his primary client was Disney. And what inevitably happened? The research and design center for Disney is now in Pittsburgh, not Los Angeles, right? This is the return migration. It's the return migration of talent. It's the return migration of business. It's the return migration of entrepreneurial activity. This is impacting all the communities in a positive way, except for the global cities. Places such as Chicago are going to be grappling with massive return migration problems because people are going back from whence they came. All right, rural return migration. So you have diffusing innovation economy. So remember I talked about the pinnacle of manufacturing in 1910, and it was in decline. That's what's called convergence. And what that means is it's instead of being concentrated in a few places such as Pittsburgh or Detroit, everyone gets a piece of the manufacturing pie. Well, what's happening right now with the innovation or knowledge economy, every place is competing for a piece of that pie. It's diffusing out. It's going away from San Francisco. It's even going away from places like Austin very quickly. And these are opportunities for small towns and rural communities to seize because this is changing the landscape as we know it very rapidly. I was thinking about this morning and talking with somebody else, and the gentleman from, I believe, Guatemala was talking about the high prices of Minneapolis. These are global labor markets leaving big city, landing in Minneapolis and driving up prices because they're bringing global wages with them. And it's forcing other people out who are involved in like manufacturing economy or low-wage service work. And where are they going? To small towns, because that's where the opportunity is. It's an aspirational migration. It's not, oh, I failed, I have to leave Minneapolis. They're moving to something better, a better life. And I like to bring up Ravenstein's law of migration. He has a bunch of laws, about 10 or so. They're more than 100 years old, and they're still dead on. My favorite, each migration flow produces a compensating counterflow. This is functionally the age of return migration. Thank you.